There was this thing Arthur loved to do, though by virtue of its intended sensations, he would always have to happen upon it by accident. He would, while behind the wheel of his car, have occasion to place it in park while in stopped traffic. Why he did this, he didn't know, though he imagined conversations he might have had with his father when he was young and learning to drive, where perhaps Dad said, "Son, a car is a sophisticated piece of machinery, and it requires rest. So when you're not in motion, put the car in park and let that puppy sleep." And so, in line at the drive-thru, or stopped in the cul-de-sac outside the house, talking to the elderly Mr. Resich, or, as he found himself now, halted completely in heavy traffic, Arthur would put the car in park, but keep his foot on the brake pedal, and find that once the delay was over and he could spur the car back into motion, that he would lift his foot from the brake pedal, and though he remained unmoved, having entirely forgotten that he'd put the car in park, his body felt the uncanny sensation of movement, a short, vertiginous shift in his muscles and mind, his body's remembrance and anticipation and psychic realization of movement. And the world on the other side of his windshield pulsed inward toward him, then, like a slow breath, back into place, all motion reversed and revealed as an illusion. There were a number of reasons Arthur loved to do this, but beyond the pure sensuality of the act, that thrill of tricking one's own mind and body, it brought Arthur a strange, melancholic pleasure to consider the ways it represented in miniature a larger fickleness of perception and sensation. Once, while he was on his lunch break, Arthur decided to follow a sudden whim and take his peanut butter sandwich to a bench in an outdoor nook around the block from his workplace. It was, he presumed, some kind of city planner's half-hearted attempt to naturalize an urban space. It lacked any trees, encompassing little more than 10 square feet of ill-kept grass, framed by a cracked concrete walkway and surrounded on 3 of its edges by a building that neighbored his office, a vagrant green square inlaid in a harsh brick-and-mortar U, soaring up 5 or 10 or maybe 20 floors. Arthur could never quite guess at a building's actual size from the ground, and someone admired those who could, if they happened upon some building at random, declare, for example, "That's a 7-story building." And he had similar admiration for the like, as when Mr. Resich would spout, without reservation, the exact yardage between his garden and Arthur's front lawn. One bench sat facing in toward this strange green enclosed space, and occasionally Arthur would wonder if he would find some solace in its isolation. And he did on this particular occasion, though in a perfectly bittersweet fashion of which he was now reminded in his current vehicular meditations. He had sat at this bench, facing inward toward the severe face of brick and glass. He pulled out his sandwich, first from his pocket, then out of its protective plastic bag, and he took a bite, starting as he always did, with the top corner of the bread. Then he looked up, and he saw that there were 2 parallel windows facing one another on either side. He wondered if these were perhaps adjacent offices, and whether their inhabitants shared glances across the expanse, or if one left messages for the other on sticky notes pressed against the glass, or if they both kept their shades drawn, each not knowing the other did the same, assuming their gaze would only invade each respective space. Arthur thought, there are so many tasks that are easy to do when alone, but become almost impossible when there exists even the possibility of another's gaze. Then, Arthur thought, perhaps this is why he felt like walking to this encased space. sitting on this hard bench set in concrete before a pathetic stretch of dying grass, cocooned in brick and mortar. It was much easier to simply sit and eat his sandwich and be alone with his thoughts than in the kitchenette at work, where there was always the possibility of some sort of disruption or invasion. As Arthur considered all this, an unnoticed weakness of the constitution of his sandwich's bread reached its breaking point, and at least a third of it split away and slipped right from his hand and onto the grass before him. He sat, dumbstruck for one moment, frustrated for another, and then looked at the fragile piece of sandwich left in his hand. Then he stared down beyond it, to the concrete of the walkway below his bench, and he noticed stark, shadowy outlines of maple leaves, like the earth itself was scorched and left only the leaves' tenebrous ghosts behind. He took another bite of his sandwich, and knew now that he had been eating it completely without consideration or sensation. Moments like this would, on occasion, send him through dizzying mental travails, and he'd remember, for example, an occasion when he drove home from work after a particularly tiring day, and he'd pay no mind to the details of the commute, and simply arrive in his driveway as if through some spectral passage from his office's exit to his front door. There was simply no room in his brain, he would think, to participate in every single moment, to earnestly digest every feeling, to know the feel of his car's synthetic leather steering wheel as his fingers wrapped around it, nor the routine taste of wheat bread and peanut butter. These experiences all persisted merely as expansions of bodily automation, as natural and unremarked upon as blood flow. Then, chewing slowly, staring at the rust-brown stained contours of dead leaves, Arthur sensed the subtle sting of salt, and the rhythm of his breaths, and the shifts of cold wind tunneling down about the brick monolith surrounding this miniature park. He thought, this moment, this is itself some kindred experience to sitting in another's gaze. There are instances, he thought then, and recalled now, that he glanced at himself as if through a window across a chasm, and could perceive himself and feel himself perceived, as if by another contained within himself. There are times when one is alone, he thought, and there are times when one is in the company of oneself. Arthur remembered all this now. In the moment just after his foot left the brake and his car's phantom acceleration left him in place but not, moving but still, his eyes seeing and not seeing, the world outside the frame of his windshield flow as if observed through layers of liquid glass. Arthur pondered on these feelings, and it brought him joy to consider them. To recognize these innocuous frailties, each some small recognition of that which expands ever outward from discrete space and sees itself crumble and coalesce in kind, that which is ebbing and flowing in accordance with that which is not.